Welcome to Classified Culture. This channel was created to provide new and original stories for anyone enthusiastic about science fiction and horror stories. If this is your first time listening, or if you are a returning member, thank you for your support and attention. If you are enjoying the content in today's story, please take a moment to like this video, leave a message in the comments section, and subscribe to the channel. Well, I suppose there is not much else to say, other than my favorite reason for being here has arrived. It's time to let the words I speak guide your imagination with a dark and twisted tale. Henry stood at the mouth of the mine, his breath visible in the chill air. The shaft yawned before him like a black maw, swallowing light and hope. He could feel the weight of the earth above pressing down on him, whispering ancient secrets into the cold. He hesitated, one foot hovering over the threshold, but the thought of his helmet light, his only beacon in this forsaken place, pushed him forward. The entrance was a tight squeeze, forcing Henry to turn sideways and inch his way deeper into the mine's belly. The walls were slick with moisture, and he could feel the dampness seeping through his jacket. The air grew thick with the scent of decay and something else, something acrid that caught in his throat. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing glints of quartz embedded in the rock face. It was beautiful, but there was no time to appreciate it. He needed to find his light, get what he came for, and leave this place behind. The thought echoed in his mind like a mantra as he ventured further into the mine. The tunnel opened up into a cavernous chamber, the ceiling lost to sight above. Henry played his flashlight across the walls, picking out the rusted remnants of mining equipment and the occasional glint of coal. He squinted at each gleam, but none were his lost light. It had been months since he'd been here last, months since he'd carelessly dropped it into the darkness. He pressed on, the silence broken only by the crunch of gravel underfoot and the distant drip of water echoing like a slow, steady heartbeat. The mine seemed to swallow sound, making each step feel like an intrusion into its ancient slumber. The tunnel narrowed again, squeezing him like a vice. Panic fluttered in his chest, but he pushed it down, focusing instead on the cold hardness of the rock against his back. This was just a mine after all. It couldn't hurt him, could it? His flashlight caught something shiny ahead. He quickened his pace, hope surging through him like adrenaline. But as he approached, he realized it wasn't his light. It was something else entirely. A pickaxe lay on the ground, its shaft snapped in two, the head buried deep into the earth, as if it had been driven there with great force. Henry knelt down, running his fingers over the cold metal. There were no signs of rust, no dust coating the surface. This hadn't been abandoned long ago. This was recent. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. He stood up abruptly, scanning the darkness ahead with renewed unease. What kind of person would come down here and drive a pickaxe into the ground? And why? Henry took another step forward, his foot catching on something solid. He looked down, his flashlight beam revealing a boot sticking out from behind a pile of rubble. His heart pounded in his ears as he stepped closer, shining his light onto what lay beyond. It was a body, or what remained of one. The flesh was gone, picked clean by time and something else. Something that left behind strange, glistening marks on the bone. Henry leaned in, disgust warring with morbid curiosity, when suddenly the beam of his flashlight flickered, casting grotesque shadows over the scene. Panic surged through him again, but this time, he welcomed it, letting it propel him away from that awful sight. He stumbled back the way he'd come, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his mind racing with horrors unknown. Then he heard it, a faint scratching sound echoing behind him. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate, like something sharp scraping against rock. Henry froze, listening. It came again, louder this time, closer. He could feel the vibrations through the soles of his boots. Fear rooted him to the spot as the realization dawned on him. He wasn't alone down here. Something else was moving through these tunnels, something that had no business being alive, and it was coming his way. The flashlight flickered again, plunging Henry into darkness for a split second before wavering back to life. In that moment of blackness, he felt something cold brush against his cheek, like the touch of rotted flesh. He cried out, swinging his arm wildly behind him, but whatever it was had already moved on. He turned and ran, the beam of his flashlight bouncing crazily off the walls as he fled deeper into the mine. The scratching sound pursued him, growing louder, more insistent with each passing second. It seemed to echo from every direction, mocking him, herding him towards some inevitable end. Henry skidded around a bend, desperation lending speed to his legs. He could see light up ahead, faint but unmistakable, the entrance. Hope surged through him again, hot and heady, urging him forward. But as he neared the exit, something snagged his ankle, tripping him. Henry went down hard, his flashlight flying from his grasp. It landed a few feet away, its beam casting eerie shadows on the ceiling above. He looked back over his shoulder, expecting to see whatever had been chasing him, but there was nothing there. Then he felt it, the cold grip around his ankle tightening like a vice. Panic surged through him once more, but this time fear rooted him in place, paralysis stealing over his limbs as he stared into the darkness behind him. Something moved within that blackness, a shape shifting and changing form, impossible to discern in the flickering light. It seemed to absorb the darkness around it, growing larger, more solid with each passing second. And then, suddenly, it spoke. "Stay," it rasped, its voice like gravel grinding together. "You're not leaving." Henry opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His breath caught in his throat as terror gripped him, freezing his lungs, stilling his heart. He could only watch helplessly as the thing reached for him, its fingers elongating into sharp talons that glinted wickedly in the flashlight's dying light. But then, miraculously, the beam steadied, illuminating the face of whatever was about to claim him. And what Henry saw there would haunt his dreams until his final breath, if he even had one left to take. For the thing that looked back at him was not some monstrous creature born of darkness and decay, but something far worse, a reflection of himself. A reflection twisted beyond recognition by madness and hunger, eyes glinting with insane fury, teeth bared in a rictus grin. It was Henry's own face staring back at him, but it was no longer his own. It belonged to something else entirely, a thing that had been waiting here in the darkness for a very long time. And now, finally, it had found its way out. The flashlight flickered one last time before dying completely, plunging Henry into eternal night. But even as he screamed into the abyss, he knew it was too late. He had stepped willingly into this tomb, and now there would be no escape from what lay. Henry's scream echoed through the collapsed mine shaft, a raw and primal sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth around him. But there was no echo, no reply save for the distant drip, drip, drip of water echoing his terror in its own grim rhythm. Panic surged through him again, breaking the paralysis that had held him rooted to the spot. He wrenched his leg free with a strength born of desperation and fled, stumbling blindly into the darkness. The air grew colder as he ventured deeper into the mine, the chill seeping into his bones like an icy hand clutching at his heart. His breath misted before him in stark contrast to the blackness that pressed against his face, threatening to smother him if he so much as slowed his pace. But even fear could not override the instinct for self-preservation that drove him on, away from that terrible reflection and whatever it was that now wore Henry's face like a mask. The mine shaft twisted and turned like a serpent, each bend revealing more of the same unyielding darkness. His outstretched hands scraped against rough stone walls, slick with moisture, seeking purchase in the treacherous footing. Once, twice, he slipped on loose gravel, falling hard onto his knees before scrambling back up, driven by the relentless urge to escape. As he ran, Henry became aware of a strange sensation, a feeling of weightlessness, as if the very air around him had grown dense and heavy. It pressed down upon him from all sides, crushing him with an invisible force that seemed intent on grinding his bones into dust. His lungs burned for want of breathable air, each ragged gasp drawing more coldness into his body than warmth. And then, without warning, the ground gave way beneath him. Henry plummeted downwards, arms flailing wildly as he sought to grab onto something, anything, to halt his fall. But there was nothing but empty space, and the cruel laughter of gravity pulling him ever deeper into the earth's embrace. He hit the bottom hard, all breath driven from his lungs in a whoosh of pain. For a moment, Henry lay there amidst the debris, dazed and disoriented, unable to move even if he'd wanted to. Then, slowly, his senses began to return, bringing with them the full force of his predicament. Above him, where once had been solid ground, now yawned an abyss. The entrance had collapsed behind him, sealing off any hope of retreat. He was trapped, buried alive beneath countless tons of earth and stone, with no light save for the faint glow of his dying flashlight clutched weakly in one hand. Panic threatened to overwhelm him once more, but Henry fought it back, summoning every ounce of self-control he possessed. Now was not the time to lose himself to fear. Now was the time to think, to plan, to find a way out of this nightmare before it consumed him completely. But even as he forced himself to breathe deeply and calm his racing heart, Henry knew that escape would not be easy. The shaft above had collapsed entirely, leaving no visible means of ascent. To either side stretched more tunnels leading deeper into the mine's labyrinthine heart, each one promising further darkness and uncertainty. And then there was the matter of what lay behind him, the thing that wore his face like a mask. It had spoken to him, told him to stay, as if it knew already that he was trapped here with no hope of escape. The memory of those mad eyes glinting in the flashlight's dying light sent shivers down Henry's spine, but he refused to dwell on it. Instead, he focused on his surroundings, searching for any clue that might lead him back towards the surface. His gaze fell upon a heap of shattered timbers nearby, remnants of the mine's long-abandoned support system. They lay scattered across the chamber floor like the bones of some ancient beast, their splintered ends jutting out at odd angles. It seemed almost inevitable that he should stumble upon such a sight here. After all, this was where the mine had first begun to die. As Henry approached the wreckage, he noticed something strange about the broken beams. They appeared to have been snapped clean through, their fibers torn apart with a violence that belied the passage of time. It was as if some great force had burst forth from within the mine itself, tearing its way outwards and leaving nothing but destruction in its wake. A chill ran down Henry's spine at the thought, but he pushed it aside, concentrating instead on the task at hand. If these timbers could support the weight of the earth above them once, perhaps they might still serve their purpose now. With careful consideration, he began to gather up the broken lengths, stacking them one upon another, until they formed a makeshift ladder reaching towards the distant darkness above. It was slow, painstaking work made all the more difficult by the encroaching gloom of his failing flashlight. Each beam had to be placed with precision, balanced against its fellows lest the whole structure come crashing down around him. And even then, Henry knew that climbing it would be no easy feat. The mine was vast and deep, its secrets hidden away in places where sunlight never shone. But he had no choice. To stay here meant certain death, whether at the hands of whatever had claimed his face or through slow suffocation amidst the wreckage of his own making. No, better to risk life and limb upon this precarious ladder than wait here for madness, or worse, to claim him completely. So it was that Henry began to climb, fingers raw and bleeding from gripping the splintered edges of each beam. His muscles screamed in protest as he hauled himself upwards inch by agonizing inch, every fiber of his being crying out against the strain. Yet still, he persisted, driven on by desperation and the grim determination not to die here like some forgotten miner lost amidst the shadows. As he climbed higher, Henry became aware of a strange sensation, a feeling of weightlessness once more, but this time accompanied by an odd sense of detachment from his own body. It was as if he were floating outside himself, watching another man struggle upwards through the darkness toward some unseen goal. He could see him plainly now, a pathetic creature clad in dust and blood, his eyes wild with terror and madness. And then, without warning, that other Henry spoke. "Go back," it rasped, its voice echoing eerily within Henry's mind. "Turn around and go back." Henry faltered, one hand slipping from its precarious hold upon the beam above. For a moment he teetered there on the brink of disaster, balanced between life and death by nothing more than sheer force of will. "Go back," the voice insisted, growing louder now, more insistent. "There's still time to save yourself." But Henry knew better. He had seen what lay behind him, seen it reflected in those mad eyes, and he would not go back into that darkness, not even if it meant falling to his death here amidst the wreckage of his own folly. "No," he whispered hoarsely, clenching his jaw against the pain that racked his. Henry's foot found purchase on a sturdy beam, and with a final heave he pulled himself clear of the abyss. The narrow tunnel stretched out before him, swallowed by darkness, except for a meager circle cast by his flickering flashlight. He slumped against the cold wall, gasping for breath, each inhalation raw and painful in his chest. As his heart slowed, so did time itself, stretching out interminably around him. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant drip of water echoing through the labyrinthine mine, like a macabre metronome, counting out the seconds, until... What? Until he found escape? Or until something else found him? Henry pushed off from the wall, forcing his jelly-like legs to move. The tunnel twisted and turned like a snake, devouring what little light his failing flashlight could provide. Shadows danced at the edges of its glow, writhing and twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to beckon him deeper into the mine's bowels. His claustrophobia began to manifest as a tightness in his chest, each breath coming harder than the last. The walls pressed in around him, closing like a vice, threatening to crush him if he didn't keep moving forward. But with every step, the pressure increased, squeezing the air from his lungs until he felt like a fish flopping helplessly on land. Panic surged through him, hot and acidic. His heart hammered against his ribs, sending tendrils of fear spiraling outwards into his limbs. He wanted to run, to flee to this claustrophobic nightmare, but the narrowness of the tunnel demanded caution. One misstep could spell disaster in these treacherous depths. As he rounded yet another bend, Henry's flashlight began to flicker ominously. Panic surged anew at the thought of being plunged into total darkness down here, where no one would ever find him. He shook it desperately, willing its light to hold out just a little longer. The beam steadied briefly before wavering again, casting bizarre shadows that seemed to dance mockingly around him. Henry's breath hitched in his throat as he noticed something else. The walls were no longer bare rock but covered in strange symbols carved deeply into the stone. They weren't mere markings. They pulsed with an eerie life, glowing faintly like bioluminescent algae. As he watched, transfixed by horror, the symbols began to change shape, twisting and writhing as if alive. They seemed to writhe towards him, hungry, seeking. Henry stumbled back, dropping his flashlight in his haste. It clattered away into the darkness, leaving him alone with only the faint glow of those malevolent symbols for light. He turned to flee, but his foot caught on something solid protruding from the floor. He went down hard, landing on his hands and knees amidst a scattering of bones. Human bones. Revulsion coursed through him as he scrambled away, but there was no escaping the macabre reminder of what had once happened here. And now, he too was trapped, lost in this forgotten tomb, where even the dead did not rest easy. A cold draft blew past him, carrying with it a sound that made his blood run cold, whispering voices echoing through the tunnels like a chorus of damned souls. They called out to him, their words indistinguishable yet somehow malevolent nonetheless. He clapped his hands over his ears, but still he heard them, felt their icy breath on his neck. Henry stumbled to his feet, desperate now to find an exit, anything that would take him away from these terrible whispers and the glowing symbols that seemed to be closing in around him like jaws of stone. But each tunnel looked much like the last, a twisting, turning labyrinth designed by some mad architect to torment the unwary. He ran blindly, his breath coming in ragged gasps as panic threatened to overwhelm him completely. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, pressing against him from all sides until he could barely think straight. And then, without warning, they fell silent. But not for long. A new sound filled the void, a low rumble growing steadily louder, shaking loose debris from the ceiling above. It was the sound of something massive moving through the tunnels towards him. Henry's heart hammered in his chest as realization dawned. Whatever had spoken to him through his reflection was down here, and it was coming for him. He turned to run just as a section of wall gave way behind him, revealing a gaping black maw leading deeper into the mine's bowels. With no time to react, Henry pitched forward into the abyss, swallowed whole by darkness absolute. Henry tumbled downwards, limbs flailing, arms outstretched. He expected to hit the bottom at any moment, but the darkness seemed endless. Panic surged within him as he realized there might be no end to this descent, that he could fall forever into this abyss. Then, with a bone-jarring thud, his back slammed against something solid. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs and sent stars exploding behind his eyes. He lay there for several seconds, dazed and wheezing, before his senses returned enough to assess his situation. He was no longer falling. Instead, he found himself sprawled on a rough sloping surface that seemed to be moving. A low rumble echoed through it, growing louder by the second. Henry rolled onto his side just as understanding dawned. This wasn't a floor. It was a vast conveyor belt, and it was carrying him deeper into the mine's belly. Panic surged again, hot and electric, but there was no fighting gravity's pull or the relentless grip of that ancient machinery. He tried to sit up, to look around for any means of escape, but all he could see were more tunnels branching off in every direction, like veins leading into a monstrous heart. As suddenly as it had begun, the conveyor belt shuddered to a halt. Henry stumbled forward, barely catching himself before plunging into another abyss, a gaping chasm that yawned before him, revealing only more darkness below. He backed away cautiously, his breath misting in the sudden cold. Then he heard it, the sound of water dripping somewhere ahead. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped towards it, each footfall echoing ominously against the silence. The air grew colder still, heavy with moisture, and something else, a scent faint but unmistakable. Rot. The tunnel opened up into a cavernous space, and Henry found himself standing on what appeared to be an observation platform, overlooking another massive mine shaft. But this one was unlike any he'd seen before. The walls were slick with condensation, their surfaces glistening like wet skin under the dim light filtering down from above. And carved into those walls were symbols, more of those sinister markings that seemed alive and writhing despite being mere stone. But it wasn't the symbols that made Henry's heart freeze in his chest. It was what they depicted, monstrous entities, their bodies grotesque parodies of human form, twisted limbs outstretched as if reaching for him. Their eyes were hollow voids, yet he could feel them watching, waiting. A chill ran down his spine, and not just from the cold. He knew those faces. They were the same as the ones in his reflection. The realization sent a jolt of terror coursing through him. This was no mere hallucination. Whatever he faced here was real. He backed away from the edge, his gaze still locked on the nightmarish figures, etched into stone. That's when he noticed something else. Faint lines running along the floor between the two platforms, almost invisible, but for their subtle sheen, they seemed to pulse with the same sickly light as those damned symbols. Henry hesitated, then stepped onto one of the lines. It felt cold beneath his boot, and there was a brief flash of light before darkness swallowed him whole once more. When his vision cleared, he found himself standing in yet another tunnel, this one barely wide enough for him to squeeze through sideways. But at least it seemed to be leading upwards. Relief surged within him as he began to climb, each handhold and foothold bringing him closer to escape. The whispers hadn't followed him here. Perhaps they couldn't reach him anymore. Perhaps this was his way out. But hope proved fleeting. No sooner had the thought crossed his mind Then a low growl echoed behind him, reverberating through the tight confines of the tunnel like thunder. Henry froze, listening as the sound grew louder still, closer. Something cold and damp brushed against his ankle. He kicked out instinctively, connecting with flesh that felt wrong somehow, too soft, too yielding. Another growl answered, this one filled with fury. Then came a voice, deep and guttural, speaking words that should never have been spoken. Henry. It knew his name. Terror rooted him in place for precious seconds before primal instinct kicked in again. He scrambled up the tunnel as fast as he could, ignoring the sharp rocks tearing at his flesh, the burning ache in his muscles. The creature pursuing him seemed equally unaffected by such mortal concerns. Its growls echoed ever closer, hot breath now scalding his heels. Then came a sudden jolt of pain, teeth sinking deep into his calf muscle. Henry screamed, falling forward as agony exploded along his leg. But there was no time for weakness, no time to tend wounds or give in to fear. He dragged himself onwards, leaving behind a trail of blood that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. The tunnel opened up into another cavern, this one smaller, but no less terrifying. For here hung more bodies, hung by their necks from rusted chains, swaying gently, as if disturbed only moments ago. And among them was something else. Something humanoid, its body twisted and broken beyond recognition, except for the familiar face staring out at him with empty eyes. Henry. The voice resonated through the cavern now, bouncing off the walls, echoing inside his skull. He stumbled towards the far wall, desperate for escape, only to find it blocked by a massive pile of rubble, collapsed timbers and broken stone that would take hours to clear, maybe days. Trapped. There was nowhere left to run, no more tunnels leading out. Just this hellish place filled with rotting corpses and whispered horrors. Henry sank down onto his haunches, clutching his wounded leg, as despair threatened to consume him completely. And then he saw it, the faintest glimmer of light coming from somewhere beneath the rubble. It pulsed like a heartbeat, steady yet hesitant, as if calling out to him, offering hope amidst despair. Henry reached for it, fingers digging into cold stone and rotting wood, dragging himself inch by agonizing inch towards that distant beacon. He didn't know what lay beyond, couldn't even begin to guess at what new terrors awaited him there. But he knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, he would face it standing tall, eyes wide open, no longer afraid of the darkness within or without. For now, however, there was only pain and exhaustion, and the faint promise of light somewhere ahead. And so, Henry dug deeper, clawing his way through the debris, driven onward by desperation and the lingering echo of that terrible whisper. Henry. The light flickered again, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls like tormented souls. Henry paused, breath ragged in his chest, hands still buried in the debris. The rubble seemed to breathe with him now, shifting infinitesimally each time he inhaled or exhaled, as if sharing his air. He leaned back on his heels, rubbing his bloodied hands together to clear away some of the grime. In that momentary respite, something caught his eye, a glint of metal amidst the rot and stone. He reached for it, fingers closing around a cool, familiar object, a flashlight. Its casing was dented, lens cracked, but when he pressed the switch, it sputtered to life, casting a weak beam into the darkness. The light picked out more details than Henry cared to see. More bodies among the rubble, faces frozen in silent screams, twisted metal that might once have been tools or weapons, and something else, something moving. He swept the beam across the floor, illuminating one of the glowing lines etched there. It pulsed with an internal rhythm, like a heartbeat, visible beneath translucent skin. Henry's heart hammered against his ribs as he followed the line with his eyes. It snaked through the debris, weaving between rocks and broken timbers, leading him back towards the cavern wall, and towards whatever had caused that fleeting glimpse of movement. He tracked it carefully, stepping over or around obstacles, his injured leg protesting each time he placed weight on it. The light played across more carvings etched into the walls, grotesque faces leering out at him, teeth bared in silent snarls. They seemed to watch his progress, eyes following him as he limped past. Then, without warning, the line ended abruptly. Henry played the flashlight's beam over the wall, revealing a narrow opening concealed behind a pile of loose stones. Beyond it, darkness yawned like an open maw. Henry hesitated. He could still see that faint light pulsing beneath the rubble. But something drew him towards this new discovery. A sense of inevitability, perhaps, or simply curiosity mingled with dread. Whatever lay beyond that opening, he knew he had to find out. He stepped into the gap, squeezing through sideways until his shoulders cleared the wall. Then, turning around, he aimed the flashlight beam into the darkness ahead. The light barely reached the far end of a narrow tunnel that seemed to angle slightly upwards, his first sign of escape since falling down that damned shaft. But there was no relief in this discovery, only more tension coiling within him, like a serpent ready to strike. For now, though, he chose hope over fear and pushed on, picking his way carefully along the uneven floor. The air grew colder as he went deeper, carrying with it a strange smell, acrid like burning metal, but underlying that something else, something organic and rotten. Henry tried not to think about what might cause such an odor, focusing instead on putting one foot in front of the other, ignoring the protests from his wounded leg. The tunnel opened up suddenly into another cavern, this one smaller than those before, but no less terrifying. Here hung more bodies, hung by their wrists from rusted chains, swaying gently as if disturbed only moments ago. And among them was something else. Something humanoid, its body twisted and broken beyond recognition, except for the familiar face staring out at him with empty eyes. Henry's breath caught in his throat. It was like looking into a distorted mirror, a grotesque parody of himself hanging there amidst the dead. He stumbled back, heart pounding wildly, flashlight beam trembling in his grasp. And then he heard it again. That same whisper echoing through the cavern now, bouncing off the walls, resonating inside his skull. "Henry!" He staggered backwards, desperate for escape, only to find his retreat blocked by a massive pile of rubble, collapsed timbers and broken stone that would take hours to clear, maybe days. Trapped. There was nowhere left to run, no more tunnels leading out. Just this hellish place filled with rotting corpses and whispered horrors. Henry sank down onto his haunches, clutching his wounded leg, as despair threatened to consume him completely. His flashlight beam played over the carnage once more, lingering on that twisted figure suspended from the chain, a macabre doppelganger mocking him with its vacant stare. But then something else caught his eye, a faint glimmer of light coming from somewhere beneath the rubble. It pulsed like a heartbeat, steady yet hesitant, as if calling out to him, offering hope amidst despair. Henry reached for it, fingers digging into cold stone and rotting wood, dragging himself inch by agonizing inch towards that distant beacon. He didn't know what lay beyond, couldn't even begin to guess at what new terrors awaited him there. But he knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, he would face it standing tall, eyes wide open, no longer afraid of the darkness within or without. For now, however, there was only pain and exhaustion, and the faint promise of light somewhere ahead. And so, Henry dug deeper, clawing his way through the debris, driven onward by desperation and the lingering echo of that terrible whisper. Henry. As he neared the source of the light, he realized it emanated from a small alcove partially concealed behind a fallen beam. With one final effort, he pushed himself into the gap, emerging into a room unlike any other he'd seen so far in this godforsaken mine. This chamber was filled with machines, hulking steel contraptions that loomed over him like metallic sentinels, guarding some ancient secret. They hummed softly, their innards glowing with an eerie blue light, powering intricate networks of pipes and cables that crisscrossed the walls and ceiling. At the center of it all stood a large glass cylinder filled with swirling mist. Henry approached cautiously, flashlight beam playing over the machinery, illuminating controls and switches he couldn't begin to understand. The air here was thick with static electricity, making his skin prickle and his hair stand on end. He felt like an intruder in some forbidden laboratory, trespassing upon knowledge not meant for human eyes. The cylinder dominated his attention now, drawing him closer despite the unease coiling within him. As he circled around it, he noticed something suspended within the mist, a figure hanging limply, arms outstretched as if crucified. It was another body, but unlike those he'd seen before, this one seemed fresh. Henry reached out tentatively, fingers brushing against the cool glass. The mist swirled briefly before settling again, revealing a face frozen in terror. Young, female, unfamiliar. Yet there was something about her that stirred a flicker of recognition deep within him. He searched his memory but found nothing concrete, only echoes of half-remembered dreams. Then he saw it, the faintest glow emanating from behind the figure's back. He stepped closer still, eyes widening as he realized what hung there: wings. Delicate membranes stretched between bones, too fragile to support flight, yet unmistakably avian nonetheless. They pulsed with that same blue light coursing through the machines surrounding him. Henry's breath fogged up the glass, obscuring his view for a moment before clearing again. Those wings, they were unlike anything he'd ever seen, yet familiar in their otherworldliness, like echoes of childhood nightmares whispered into existence. He felt an inexplicable pang of dread mixed with longing, as if remembering something lost long ago. The hum of machinery changed pitch suddenly, a discordant note that set his teeth on edge. The lights flickered briefly before stabilizing, casting eerie shadows that danced macabrely across the walls. Henry jumped back instinctively, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. He swept his flashlight beam around nervously, half expecting some monstrous creature to lurch from the darkness. Nothing moved except for those damn wings, pulsing rhythmically as if they breathed life into this forsaken place. They seemed to beckon him closer, calling forth memories he couldn't quite grasp. Reluctantly, Henry stepped nearer once more, unable to resist their silent summons. As he did, the floor trembled slightly beneath his boots. Not just a vibration. This was something else, like a heartbeat resonating deep within the earth itself. The rhythm was steady, insistent, growing louder with each passing moment until it felt as though the very mine shaft throbbed in time with Henry's own pulse. A distant rumble echoed through the chamber, growing closer, louder. Then, without warning, something slammed into the glass cylinder with bone-jarring force. Henry stumbled back, shock coursing through him like electricity, his heart hammering wildly now. Another impact followed swiftly after, the sound of fists pounding against unyielding surface, accompanied by a cacophony of screams and howls. Henry's mind raced, struggling to process what was happening. Those sounds, they weren't human. They were primal, animalistic, like nothing he'd ever heard before. Yet there was something familiar about them too, whispering at the edge of his consciousness like half-remembered words, spoken in a dream. The creature, whatever it was, threw itself against the glass again and again, its fury intensifying with each failed attempt to break free. The cylinder shuddered under assault, cracks spiderwebbing across its surface, threatening to shatter at any moment. Henry stood rooted to the spot, terror freezing his limbs in place, unable to move or think clearly. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the attack stopped. Silence descended like a shroud, heavy and oppressive. The only sound was Henry's ragged breathing echoing through the chamber, punctuated by the distant drip, drip, drip of water somewhere unseen. Suddenly a voice cut through the silence, clear as day despite its otherworldly timbre. "Henry," it called out softly, beckoning him like a lover's caress. His name echoed around him, bouncing off walls and machinery until he couldn't tell where it originated from, or if he'd merely imagined it. "Who's there?" Henry croaked, voice barely above a whisper. He cleared his throat, trying again. "Show yourself." The figure hanging inside the cylinder stirred slightly, drawing his gaze once more. Those eyes, they seemed to stare right through him, filled with ancient wisdom and unspoken secrets. As he watched, transfixed, one of the wings twitched spasmodically before stilling again. "Henry," the voice came again, closer this time. It resonated within his very bones, setting them aflame with an uncanny energy that left him both exhilarated and terrified. He felt drawn towards it, compelled by forces beyond his control. "I'm here," he whispered, stepping forward tentatively. "I can hear you." The creature let out a low growl, an inhuman sound that sent shivers down Henry's spine. Yet there was intelligence behind those eyes, recognition even, as if they shared some forgotten connection. He felt both terrified and exhilarated by this realization. Then came the scent, rotten and earthy, like freshly turned grave soil mixed with decaying leaves. It hit him like a physical blow, knocking him back a step. His stomach churned in response, bile rising in his throat as memories long buried threatened to resurface. Henry stumbled backwards, fighting against the urge to retch. This smell. It was the same one he'd noticed earlier, growing stronger with each step deeper into the mine shaft. Now, here amidst these machines and horrors, it seemed almost palpable, threatening to consume him whole. A sudden movement caught his eye. The wings inside the cylinder unfurled suddenly, casting eerie shadows across the glass. They pulsed again, brighter this time, casting everything in stark blue light before flickering back into dimness. The figure moved slightly too, head turning towards him with an unnatural jerking motion, reminiscent of a puppet on strings. "Henry," it whispered again, voice like distant thunder rumbling through the chamber. "You must free me." He hesitated, torn between curiosity and fear. This thing, whatever it was, clearly wasn't human anymore. But there was something about it that demanded his attention, insisting he listen despite every instinct screaming at him to run. "Why?" he asked finally, voice barely audible even to himself. The creature let out another growl, this one softer, almost pleading. It took several attempts before words formed again, haltingly spoken, as if forgotten by disuse. "Bound, trapped, so long, alone." Henry felt a pang of sympathy despite himself. This being had been imprisoned here for who knew how long. Perhaps it deserved his help, even if he wasn't sure what releasing it might mean. "How?" he asked softly, taking another step closer. The smell was almost overwhelming now, but he could bear it for a little longer if it meant understanding more about this place and its mysteries. The creature's eyes flickered towards the controls lining one wall of the chamber. Henry followed its gaze, noting rows upon rows of switches and dials blinking with various colors, reds, blues, greens. Each seemed to correspond to different parts of the machinery surrounding them, powering who knows what sinister purpose. "I don't know how," he admitted reluctantly, turning back towards the figure. "I'm just a miner, not some expert on alien technology." "Alien?" The word echoed through his mind like thunder, bringing with it images of gray beings with enormous eyes and probing devices. But this was something else entirely. This was ancient, primal even, something born from the earth itself rather than the stars. Those wings pulsed again, brighter still, casting harsh shadows across Henry's face. He shielded his eyes instinctively, squinting against the glare. When he looked back, the creature had changed somehow. Its form seemed more solid now, less ephemeral. And those eyes, they blazed with an intensity that left him breathless. "You know," it said firmly, voice resonating within him once more. "Deep down you remember." Henry shook his head vehemently, refusing to acknowledge the truth lurking just beneath the surface of his consciousness. "No," he insisted. "I don't know anything about this place or whatever you are." The creature laughed then. "Ay." In that laugh, Henry heard echoes of his own childhood, a time when laughter was pure joy, untainted by the grim reality of life deep underground. It caught him off guard, leaving him disarmed for a moment before he could remember why he should fear this creature's amusement. The lantern flickered wildly as if disturbed by the laughter too, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls and ceiling like macabre puppets. Henry snatched it up from where he'd set it down earlier, cradling its warm metal body protectively against his chest. Its light was their only defense against whatever lay hidden in this forsaken place. As suddenly as it had begun, the laughter stopped. The creature's gaze fell heavy upon him once more, those ancient eyes seeming to peer right through him, laying bare every secret he'd ever harbored. Henry felt exposed under that scrutiny, naked and vulnerable despite his layers of dusty clothes and sturdy mining gear. "I found this," he said abruptly, holding out the lantern towards the creature. Its wings pulsed briefly in acknowledgement before falling still again. "It was at the camp outside. Thought you might need it. Or perhaps I did," he added silently, feeling foolish for bringing such a paltry offering to something so otherworldly. The creature didn't reach out to take it, though. Instead, it simply looked at him with those same knowing eyes, while its form shimmered and shifted like smoke caught in sunlight. Henry swallowed hard, trying to ignore the pounding of his heart against his ribs. He'd faced danger before, cave-ins, flooding shafts, even a close call with a rattlesnake once. But this was different. This felt alive. "I don't understand," he admitted finally, lowering the lantern slightly. "What are you? What do you want from me?" The creature's mouth twitched at the corners, almost like it found his confusion amusing. But when it spoke, there was no laughter in its voice, only sorrow. "I am what you made me," it said quietly. "And I want release." Henry frowned, puzzled. "Made you? I don't understand. How could I have—" He broke off suddenly as a thought struck him, unpleasant and unwelcome. Could this thing be somehow connected to the experiments they'd conducted down here? The ones he'd heard whispers about but never seen evidence of? The creature seemed to sense his sudden realization, because it nodded slowly, wings pulsing softly in encouragement. "Yes," it whispered. "You know more than you think." Henry took a step back involuntarily, suddenly needing distance between himself and this monstrous creation. But as he moved, the lantern's light swung wildly across the chamber, illuminating something he hadn't noticed before. Words carved into the wall behind the creature. He squinted at them, tilting his head to better read the faded letters under the flickering glow. They appeared to be a date and some sort of designation. 1923. Project Osiris. His mind supplied the rest of the story automatically. Tales passed down among miners about how during the Great Depression, desperate men had done desperate things in these mines. Things like experimenting on captured creatures. "Osiris," he whispered aloud, testing the name. It tasted strange on his tongue, foreign yet familiar somehow, like something long forgotten, but not quite gone. The creature made a sound then, a low, throaty rumble that might have been approval or agreement. Either way, it seemed pleased by Henry's discovery. "Yes," it said again, voice barely above a whisper now. "That was my name once." Henry felt a chill run down his spine at the way it spoke about itself in past tense. He glanced back at those carvings, then up at the creature before him. "What happened?" he asked softly. Osiris sighed, a sound like distant thunder, and its form shimmered again briefly before settling into something more solid once more. When it spoke next, its voice held a note of resignation, as if recounting this tale was an effort too great to bear. "They brought me here," it began slowly, "a prisoner in chains. I was young then, barely more than a fledgling. Henry listened intently, hardly daring to breathe lest he miss some crucial detail. This was history being retold before his very eyes. History no book would ever record, no teacher would ever teach. "They wanted to know," Osiris continued, "how we flew so high, how we lived so long. They wanted our secrets, our power, so they experimented on me." Its voice grew colder now, harder. "They cut me open while I screamed and pleaded for mercy, but there was none to be found." Henry felt bile rise in his throat at the thought of such cruelty. He'd known men could be brutal, but this was something else entirely. And then, Osiris went on. When they thought they had learned enough, they cast me aside like discarded trash. Left me here to die alone in the dark. Henry shook his head in disgust, anger surging through him despite the fear that still gripped his heart. Why didn't you, I don't know, fly away or something? He asked heatedly. You're a creature of the skies, right? Why didn't you just leave? Osiris's laugh this time was bitter, harsh. Because, it said, they stole my wings. Henry's anger died instantly, replaced by horror, as he finally understood why those beautiful gossamer membranes had been encased in glass, instead of stretched out wide and proud. They'd taken its wings, its freedom, and left it here to suffer. He looked back at the creature now, seeing not a monster but a victim, a being wronged by men like him, and suddenly he knew what he had to do. I'll help you, he said firmly, stepping closer once more until only inches separated them. I don't know how, but I promise you, Osiris, I will find a way to set you free. Osiris stared at him for a long moment, those ancient eyes filled with something akin to wonder or perhaps disbelief. Then slowly, it reached out one trembling hand towards Henry's face. Henry froze as that cold touch brushed against his cheek, barely daring to breathe lest he shatter this fragile connection between them. But then Osiris smiled, a soft, gentle smile, and said softly, "Thank you." Those two words were enough to break whatever spell had held Henry captive these past minutes. He felt a surge of hope rise within him, stronger than any fear or doubt. With renewed determination, he took Osiris's hand in his own, and together they turned towards the chamber's controls. They were going to find a way out of here, for both of them. But first, Henry needed light. His helmet lamp might be broken, but there was another source nearby, the one he'd used earlier to search for the cylinder. He set down the lantern carefully before moving back through the shadows, towards where he remembered leaving it. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between him and Osiris. There was a connection now, a bond forged in shared suffering, and he knew he wouldn't abandon this creature again without first. Henry's fingers closed around the cold metal of the flashlight. He picked it up, its beam slicing through the darkness like a knife. As he turned back towards Osiris, the lantern's glow seemed almost inviting, a warm embrace compared to the harsh glare of the flashlight. He felt a sudden pang of guilt for leaving it behind, but pushed the thought aside. Osiris stood where Henry had left him, his form silhouetted against the faint luminescence of the control panel. As Henry approached, Osiris's eyes flickered towards him, reflecting the flashlight's light like twin lanterns in the night. There was something different about them now, a warmth that hadn't been there before. Henry offered him the flashlight. "Here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You should have this." Osiris looked at it for a moment before taking it gently from Henry's hand. He turned it over in his long fingers, examining it as if seeing such a thing for the first time. Then he clicked it on, directing the beam away from them both. "I don't need much light," Osiris said softly, "but you do." There was an echo of that ancient amusement in his voice, but this time it was tempered with gratitude. Henry nodded, feeling a strange mixture of relief and unease. He picked up the lantern, its weight familiar and comforting in his hand. Together, they turned towards the chamber's controls, their shadows dancing eerily on the walls behind them. The panel loomed before them like an ancient monument, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to defy comprehension. Henry ran his fingers over the etched metal, feeling each groove and ridge as if trying to decipher Braille. He remembered the cylinder now, tucked safely into his jacket pocket. Maybe there was something on it that could help. He pulled it out, examining it under the combined light of their two sources. The symbols here were different, more fluid, but no less alien. He held it up to the panel, comparing them side by side. There had to be a connection between these markings, some common thread he could follow. Osiris watched him silently, his reflection in the glass case warping and shifting with the flickering lantern light. Henry felt a prickle of unease at being observed so intently but pushed it aside. They were too close now to let anything stop them. After what felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes, Henry found something familiar. A series of symbols repeated along both surfaces, their arrangement slightly different each time, but unmistakably the same. He traced them with his finger, murmuring under his breath as he tried to commit them to memory. Osiris leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing slightly as he followed Henry's movements. "What have you found?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the distant drip of water somewhere deep within the mine. Henry showed him, explaining how the symbols matched up but were arranged differently on each surface. Osiris listened attentively, his expression thoughtful. Then suddenly he reached out and took hold of Henry's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Here," he said urgently, pointing at a specific sequence on the panel. "This one, it means open. I'm sure of it." Henry looked where Osiris indicated, feeling a thrill of excitement mixed with fear. They were getting closer now. The finish line was in sight, but that meant the end was too. He traced out the symbols carefully, committing them to memory alongside their others. Then he stepped back, eyeing the panel warily, as if expecting it to spring into life at any moment. But nothing happened. The chamber remained silent and still, its secrets locked away behind that impenetrable wall of metal and glass. Osiris frowned, his brow furrowing in concentration. "There must be more," he murmured, running his fingers over the symbols again, as if hoping to divine their meaning by touch alone. Something were missing. Henry nodded agreement, but said nothing, his gaze fixed on Osiris's reflection in the case. Something about it was nagging at him. A detail out of place, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. And then, suddenly, it clicked. The wings, the glass cases containing those beautiful gossamer membranes, were empty. When they'd first arrived, they'd been filled with some kind of liquid, but now they were completely dry, the wings themselves gone. He reached out tentatively, touching one of the cases where he remembered seeing a wing. It felt smooth and cold beneath his fingertips, giving no hint as to what might have happened to its contents. But something had, something significant enough that Osiris himself had mentioned it when they'd first arrived here. Henry turned to look at Osiris, who was still deep in thought over the control panel symbols. "Osiris," he said quietly, "where are your wings?" The creature froze, his body going rigid as if turned to stone. Then slowly, he turned to face Henry. Those ancient eyes filled with pain and shame. "They took them," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "Just like they took everything else." Henry felt a chill run down his spine, despite the warmth of the lantern's glow nearby. He thought back to that first moment when Osiris had spoken, and how he'd laughed at Henry's ignorance. There was something familiar about it now, echoes of a long-forgotten memory. "Your laugh," Henry began hesitantly. "It reminded me of someone. Someone from my past." Osiris looked at him curiously, those ancient eyes filled with questions unasked. But before either of them could speak further, the ground beneath their feet shifted suddenly, a low rumble warning of danger to come. Henry grabbed Osiris's arm instinctively, pulling him away from the control panel just as a section of the ceiling collapsed inward, sending a shower of rocks cascading down around them. They landed with a thud, kicking up clouds of dust that hung heavy in the air for several seconds before settling again. Henry coughed, wiping his eyes clear with the back of his hand. He looked up cautiously, half expecting another collapse, but this time, there was only silence. The mine seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something more than just a cave-in. Osiris stood beside him, his form blurred by the lingering dust but otherwise unharmed. Henry felt a surge of relief wash over him. At least they were still alive, but it was short-lived. Because now he knew, whatever had caused that collapse wasn't an accident. It was something else entirely. Something malevolent. He looked at Osiris, seeing his own fear reflected in those ancient eyes. They weren't alone down here. That much was clear now. There was something else with them, a presence they could both feel but neither could see. And it wanted blood. Henry picked up the lantern, its flame flickering wildly, as if sensing their sudden unease. He held it out before him like a sword, its light cutting through the darkness like a blade. Beside him, Osiris stood tall and proud, his form silhouetted against the flickering glow. There was no trace now of the vulnerable creature Henry had first encountered. Instead, he saw. Henry's breath misted in the cold air as they ventured deeper into the collapsed tunnel. The weight of the earth above pressed down on them, each grain of soil a silent scream, threatening to bury them alive. He could feel panic clawing at his throat, but he swallowed it down, focusing instead on Osiris's steady gait ahead. The lantern's light trembled against the jagged walls, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Henry kept one hand on Osiris's shoulder, not trusting the unstable ground beneath their feet. The mine was angry now, its ancient wounds reopened by their intrusion. Osiris paused suddenly, his head cocked as if listening to something only he could hear. Then, without warning, he turned left into a narrow crevice, barely visible in the gloom. Henry hesitated before following, squeezing through the tight gap sideways, scraping his back against rough stone. On the other side, Osiris waited patiently, lantern light casting dramatic shadows across his face. In his hands he held an old mine map, its edges frayed and yellowed with age. He offered it to Henry without a word, those ancient eyes filled with urgency. Henry took the map, tracing the faded lines with his finger until he found their current location, a dead end marked caution. Unstable. His heart sank as he realized there was no way out behind them. They were trapped. But then Osiris pointed to a thin line snaking away from their position, leading towards an area marked abandoned shafts. Below this, someone had scrawled in pencil, "Secret exit, secret exit." Hope flickered within Henry like the lantern's flame. He looked up at Osiris, questions tumbling out. "How do you know about this? Who drew this map?" Osiris merely shrugged, his gaze fixed on the distant darkness ahead. Henry studied the map again, noticing a small symbol etched beside the abandoned shafts, two circles connected by a line. It was similar to one of the alien symbols from the cylinder. He felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew that symbol meant open, but open what? He showed Osiris, who nodded gravely before disappearing into the inky blackness ahead. Henry hurried after him, clutching the map like a lifeline. The abandoned shafts were exactly that, forgotten, dangerous, and utterly terrifying. The walls here were slick with condensation, footing treacherous on loose rubble. Above them the ceiling yawned wide open, exposing rotting timbers barely holding back the crush of earth above. Henry's breath caught in his throat as he looked up, imagining tons of rock crashing down around them. He quickened his pace, nearly colliding with Osiris, who had stopped abruptly ahead. There, hanging from a rusty nail, was another mind map, newer than the first but still old enough to be discolored by time and damp. Henry unrolled it carefully, his eyes scanning the familiar lines until he found their current location. They were right on track for the secret exit. But there was something else too, a series of symbols drawn along the route they'd taken so far. They matched those from the cylinder perfectly. Henry felt a chill run through him as he realized what this meant. Someone had been here recently, someone who knew about the cylinder and its secrets, and then they'd left a trail for them to follow. He showed Osiris, whose expression remained unchanged. But when Henry pointed out the final symbol marking their destination, the abyss opens, Osiris flinched visibly. Whatever lay ahead, it was not good. They pressed on, silent now, each lost in his own thoughts. The abandoned shaft seemed endless, each turn revealing more of the same decaying mine, each step echoing ominously around them. Then, without warning, Osiris stopped again. This time, Henry saw why. Ahead loomed an enormous void where the shaft simply ended, swallowed up by some catastrophic collapse. Beyond it, faintly visible in the lantern light, was a narrow ledge leading down into utter darkness. Henry's stomach lurched at the sight. He'd always had a fear of heights, and this was his worst nightmare come to life. But there was no going back now. They were trapped here until they found that secret exit. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. Then he followed Osiris onto the ledge, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. The descent seemed endless, each step taking them closer to the unseen abyss below. Henry tried not to think about it, focusing instead on placing one foot carefully in front of the other. But every now and then, a gust of cold air would whisper up from the depths, carrying with it a faint scent of something ancient and wrong. Finally, they reached the bottom. Henry let out a shaky breath, relieved to be on solid ground again. Then he noticed Osiris staring intently at something carved into the wall beside them. It was another symbol, larger than any they'd seen before, and intricately detailed despite its age. At first glance, it appeared to depict two figures embracing beneath an archway. But upon closer inspection, Henry saw that one figure was reaching out towards him, while the other seemed to be melting. He shuddered involuntarily, stepping back from the carving as if burned. This place felt wrong, like a violation of nature itself. Osiris pointed at the symbol, then made a strange gesture with his hands, palms facing each other, moving apart slowly. Henry understood immediately. It meant open. The abyss opens. Before him loomed another shaft, narrower still than those they'd traversed so far. It was barely wide enough for them to squeeze through side by side, let alone carry a lantern safely ahead. But there was no mistaking the sense of foreboding that hung heavy in the air around it. This was their way out. Henry took a deep breath, trying to steady himself against the rising panic inside him. Then he turned to Osiris, gave him a determined nod, and stepped into the darkness. They moved cautiously, inches apart now, lantern light flickering eerily off the smooth walls around them. The air grew colder still, damp with condensation that clung like icy fingers whenever they brushed against it. And then, without warning, something touched Henry's shoulder. He froze, every muscle taut as steel. It felt like a hand, cold, damp, and unmistakably alive. Panic surged through him, but he held it back, forcing himself to breathe silently as he listened intently for any sound of movement behind them. Osiris seemed unfazed, continuing forward without pause. But Henry couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, hunted even. Every shadow seemed alive with menace, every creak and groan of the mine echoing ominously around them. Suddenly, Osiris stopped again. This time, when Henry looked ahead, he saw why. A vast cavern yawned before them, its walls stretching out into infinity on either side. At its center stood an immense stone archway, carved with more symbols that seemed to writhe and twist in the lantern light. Henry felt his blood run. As they stood at the edge of the cavern, Henry felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The air here was different, charged with an electric tension that prickled his skin. He looked down at Osiris, who seemed as still as stone, his gaze fixed on something within the vast space ahead. Henry followed his line of sight and saw it, a glint of metal in the shadows beneath the archway. It was too symmetrical to be natural, too deliberate to be random. As they stepped closer, the lantern light revealed more details, carved symbols matching those from the cylinder, scattered like morbid confetti across the floor. Osiris moved forward without hesitation, his footsteps echoing loudly against the smooth stone. Henry followed, each step heavier than the last, as if wading through treacle. He couldn't shake off the sensation that they were not alone in this place, that unseen eyes watched their every move. As they reached the archway, Osiris paused. He pointed upwards at a symbol carved deep into the stone above them. It was the same one from earlier. The abyss opens, but now it seemed to stare down at Henry like a malevolent eye. He felt his heart pound in his chest, echoing the rhythm of some ancient, waking beast. Beyond the archway, another shaft yawned wide and welcoming. Too welcoming. It reeked of trap, of deliberate enticement. Yet Osiris led them on without pause, his urgency now palpable despite his unchanging pace. Henry could feel it too, an irresistible pull drawing them deeper into the mine's heart. The passage widened slightly here, enough for Henry to carry the lantern ahead while Osiris brought up the rear. Shadows danced around them, grotesque figures twisted by the flickering light. The walls glistened with moisture, reflecting their distorted forms back at them like mocking specters. Suddenly Osiris stopped again. This time when Henry turned back, he saw fear etched plainly on the older man's face. His eyes were wide, fixed on something behind Henry. Slowly, Henry rotated his head to follow Osiris's gaze. At first, he saw nothing but more of the same: damp walls, twisted shadows. Then he noticed a faint movement out of the corner of his eye. Something shifted in the darkness, sliding along the wall like oil across water. It was large, amorphous, and utterly silent. Henry's breath caught in his throat as terror gripped him. He wanted to run, but paralysis held him rooted to the spot. All he could do was watch, frozen, as the entity began to take shape before them. It was human-like yet grotesquely distorted, its limbs elongated and twisted into impossible angles. Its skin was slick and black like polished obsidian, reflecting the lantern light in sickening flashes of white. And its eyes, they were milky orbs that seemed to absorb all light, swallowing it whole. Henry felt bile rise in his throat as he realized what those eyes reminded him of: the carvings back at the entrance. This creature was real, alive, and it bore an uncanny resemblance to the figures etched into stone centuries ago. Osiris spoke then, his voice barely above a whisper but filled with urgency nonetheless. "We must run," he said, already turning away from the entity. But Henry couldn't move, held fast by some unseen force exerted by that malevolent gaze. Then, as if summoned by Osiris's words, chaos erupted around them. The creature lunged forward with a speed that belied its size, its elongated limbs stretching like taffy as it reached for them. The lantern flew from Henry's grasp, clattering away into the darkness and leaving them in near total blackness. Panic surged through Henry now, breaking him free from his paralysis. He spun around and ran after Osiris, their footfalls echoing wildly off the walls of the shaft. Behind them, he could hear the creature's pursuit, not quite footsteps but more like wet, dragging sounds that sent shivers down his spine. They raced through twisting corridors, leaped over piles of debris, and slid down inclines slick with moisture. The mine seemed to twist around them deliberately, each turn leading them deeper into its labyrinthine heart, rather than towards escape. But still they ran, driven on by primal fear that demanded survival above all else. Henry could feel the entity gaining ground behind him. He could almost sense its cold breath on his neck. It was only a matter of time before those elongated limbs snared him, pulled him back into that black embrace. Suddenly, Osiris skidded to a halt ahead. Henry nearly collided with him, but managed to stop just in time. They stood there panting, backs pressed against the wall as the entity caught up behind them. Henry braced himself for impact, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. But nothing happened. Instead, he felt Osiris's hand grasp his arm tightly, pulling him sideways into a narrow side passage they hadn't noticed before. They stumbled along this new path blindly, hands trailing against the walls to guide them. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Henry saw a faint glow of light up ahead. They were nearing an opening, perhaps their final chance at escape. As they emerged from the side passage, Henry cast one last glance back over his shoulder. For a moment, he thought he saw something moving in the darkness behind them. But it was too late now. They had reached the end of this particular line. Before them lay not freedom, but another cavern, smaller than the first but no less terrifying. The walls here were lined with more carvings, rows upon rows of those twisted figures, all seeming to stare directly at Henry, as if aware of his presence. In the center of the cavern stood a massive stone pillar, its surface smooth save for a single inscription. "Here lies the abyss." And there, at its base, was the glint of metal they'd seen earlier, a cylinder identical to the one Osiris carried. Osiris moved towards it without hesitation, kneeling down to examine the artifact more closely. Henry, meanwhile, couldn't take his eyes off those carvings. They seemed even more disturbing up close, their features twisted into expressions of pure agony or rapture, or perhaps both at once. Suddenly, Osiris spoke again. "This is it," he said, holding up the cylinder so that its symbols matched those carved into the stone above them. "The abyss opens here." Henry tore his gaze away from the carvings to look at Osiris. He saw determination etched deep into the older man's face, but also something else, a faint glimmer of fear perhaps. Or was it resignation? Before Henry could respond, the ground beneath their feet trembled violently. Dust rained down from the ceiling, filling the air with choking clouds. Then came the sound, a low rumble that grew louder and more insistent by the second. The mine was collapsing around them. Henry felt panic surge through him once more, but Osiris seemed undeterred. He stepped towards Henry, placing his hands on either side of the younger man's shoulders. "Listen to me." For a long moment, nothing happened. Henry held the cylinder steady against the panel, his breath shallow, his pulse hammering in his ears. The symbols shimmered faintly under the lantern's glow, their shape seeming to shift the longer he stared. Then, a low vibration rolled through the chamber. Not loud, not violent, just deep, ancient. The metal panel beneath his hands grew warm. The symbols began to glow, first faintly, then brighter, until thin veins of light pulsed outward like blood moving through a living body. Osiris stiffened beside him. "You hear it?" Henry whispered. Osiris nodded slowly. "I feel it," he replied. The mine answered. A groan rose from the depths of the earth. Not like collapsing stone, but like something waking after a long and tortured sleep. The ground trembled beneath Henry's boots. Dust sifted down from above in soft, choking clouds. Then came the sound. A wet cracking, like bone breaking. Henry turned sharply. Behind them, the glass cases that once held Osiris's wings began to fracture. Hairline cracks spread across their surfaces, racing outward in jagged patterns. One burst open. Fluid long dried to dust fell away in brittle flakes as something inside shifted. Henry stared. The wings were not gone. They had changed, twisted, embedded into the surrounding stone as if the mine itself had swallowed them. And now, it was given them back. Osiris staggered forward, breath hitching. "My wings," he whispered. The stone groaned again, louder now. The tunnel walls flexed, actually flexed, like muscle tightening beneath skin. Henry felt it then. Not just movement. Hunger. The mine was alive. Not alive in flesh, but alive in memory, in suffering, in all the broken things buried inside it for generations. And it knew Osiris. It knew what had been done here. The symbols on the panel flared white-hot. With a violent shudder, the chamber lurched. Stone split. Glass shattered completely. And with a terrible tearing sound, the fused wings ripped free from the rock. Osiris cried out, not in pain, but in something deeper. Relief. Grief. Release. They unfolded slowly behind him, ragged, incomplete, but real. Alive, but more. The air filled with a violent rushing sound as unseen currents surged through the chamber. Henry shielded his face as debris rained down around them. "Go!" Henry shouted. Osiris turned toward him, eyes wide. "What about you?" Henry looked toward the collapsing tunnel, the way back already sealing shut under falling stone. There was no escape for him. He knew it. But Osiris still had sky waiting somewhere beyond this cursed earth. "You were never meant to die here," Henry said hoarsely. Not like this. The chamber shook violently now, stone tearing apart like wet paper. Osiris hesitated. Then, slowly, he stepped forward and placed one hand against Henry's chest. For a moment, Henry felt warmth spread through him, a strange, impossible warmth in the cold, suffocating dark. A gift. Or perhaps a forgiveness. Then, Osiris turned and leapt. His damaged wings caught the violent air currents as the tunnel ahead split open into a jagged shaft leading upward. For one impossible second, he flew. Henry watched until the darkness swallowed him. Then the mind turned its full attention back to him. The symbols burned brighter. The ground cracked beneath his boots. Stone walls folded inward like closing jaws. Henry fell to one knee, lantern clattering from his grip as dust swallowed the air around him. The last thing he saw was the panel glowing one final time. And in its molten light, new symbols carved themselves into the metal. A name. His name. Another offering. Another memory sealed into stone. The devouring vein had taken him. And far above, beyond the choking dust and collapsing tunnels, something winged broke through the surface of the earth and vanished into the open sky.